The April sun in Sarasota had that golden glow that made everything look like a postcard. The resort's ballroom sparkled with chandeliers that dripped light like diamonds, and the wide windows opened to an endless view of the ocean. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the day would be as perfect as the scene around me. I had waited for this, my wedding, to finally step into a chapter of life where I would be seen as more than the youngest, more than the one others whispered about with a smirk. I stood at the entrance, the scent of salt air drifting in when the doors opened, and listened to the gentle clatter of glasses being set on linen-covered tables. Guests were already milling about, laughter blending with the music. Everything looked polished, orchestrated, and grand. And yet, beneath the layers of satin and the gleam of silverware, I felt a flicker of unease. Maya Angelou once said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." Those words rang in my mind because I had already seen who my soon-to-be mother-in-law was. Still, I had convinced myself that today, my wedding day, would be different, that she might, just for once, let the spotlight rest on me without pulling it back to herself. My fiancé's family had influence, connections, and more money than they knew what to do with. His mother, Acantha, was the kind of woman who could silence a room with a raised eyebrow. I had learned to read the sharp tilt of her chin and the way her words carried, as if she owned not just the conversation, but the air itself. Everyone respected her, or at least feared her enough to act like they did, and as I took my first steps into the ballroom, I prayed she would keep her claws sheathed. I didn't know it then, but that hope would unravel before I even had the chance to catch my breath. The first blow came in the shape of a neatly wrapped box, topped with a ribbon so perfect it might have belonged on a magazine cover. "A gift from the heart," Acantha announced, her smile broad, her eyes gleaming. She handed it to me with exaggerated grace, ensuring the eyes of nearby guests stayed fixed on us. I peeled back the paper carefully, expecting perhaps a family heirloom or something sentimental. Instead, inside was a book, hardcover, pristine, its gold lettering catching the chandelier's light, the title cut like glass, How to Be a Proper Wife. A hush swept through the cluster of people around us, followed by scattered laughter, the kind of laughter that is half amusement, half discomfort. Acantha chuckled, tilting her head as if she'd just shared the cleverest joke of the night. "Every bride needs a manual," she said, pausing deliberately before adding, "some more than others." The words landed like a slap dressed up in lace. I swallowed hard, my face arranged into a polite smile I didn't feel. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. No one stepped in to defend me, not even the bridesmaids standing close. Their eyes darted away, lips pressed shut. Inside, I thought, she wants to brand me as unworthy before I even walk down the aisle. She wants the narrative to be hers, not mine. Guests whispered behind their glasses, some awkwardly amused, others avoiding my gaze altogether. A cousin of the groom nudged his friend and muttered, "Classic Acantha." They smirked, as though this humiliation was tradition. I lifted the book, turned it slightly in the light, and said with as much composure as I could muster, "I'll treasure it." Outwardly calm, inwardly searing. The truth was, I wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time she had tried to remind me that in her eyes I was small. But I also knew. Remembering every insult gave me power. I filed it away, certain it was no accident. Later, as guests began to wander toward the seating chart displayed on a grand easel near the ballroom doors, another sting awaited me. The board was elegant, glossy, each name written in graceful calligraphy. I walked closer, smiling at the thought of seeing Mrs. Savannah etched among the rows. But when my eyes landed on the place reserved for me, my breath caught. There it was, not my full name, not even my first name spelled right. Instead, written in looping letters, Ms. Guest. The mistake stood out all the more because every other name, every cousin, every distant relative, every business associate was perfect. No smudges, no errors, not even an extra flourish out of place. Just mine. I heard a whisper behind me. "Why isn't her name written properly?" Another voice answered with a chuckle. "Maybe she doesn't belong here." Heat rose in my cheeks. Before I could speak, Acantha breezed by, her perfume leaving a trail of roses and steel. "Oh," she said with a dismissive laugh, "it must have been a typo. Don't make a fuss." A typo on a board that cost $10,000 to produce. No, I knew better. There are no typos on a display like this, I thought, my jaw tight. This was deliberate. My fingers grazed the glossy surface where my name should have been. Invisibility disguised as a mistake. It was a cruelty sharper than open insult. Because in the eyes of everyone staring at that chart, I wasn't the bride. I was an afterthought, a placeholder, a guest at my own wedding. I stood there, shoulders back, eyes forward, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. A woman nearby shook her head slightly, muttering to her husband, "Unbelievable," but she didn't say it loud enough for anyone else to hear. I smiled at a passing couple and said, "Please, find your table." Everything set beautifully. My voice was calm, but inside, something shifted. Every time she tried to reduce me, I felt a stronger pull to resist. As laughter and chatter filled the room, I lingered near the window, staring out at the ocean beyond. The waves rolled steady, relentless, as if reminding me of something. None of this, her gift, her typo, her smirks, was random. These weren't accidents. They were warnings, like thunderclouds gathering on the horizon. I glanced back at the ballroom, where Acantha laughed with a cluster of guests, her head thrown back in triumph. She was setting the stage, preparing the show, and I was the chosen target. I didn't know then how far she would go. I didn't know that before the night was over, the entire room would be watching, and the humiliation would cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. The morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the bridal suite, filling the room with a warm glow that should have soothed me. Makeup artists circled around me, brushes and palettes in hand, while my bridesmaids laughed over mimosas in the corner. It should have felt like joy, like the promise of a perfect day. But my chest carried an uneasy weight I couldn't ignore. I sat in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman who was trying her hardest to keep her composure. "You can't control someone else's actions, but you can control your response," I whispered to myself. It was something my grandmother used to say, a piece of wisdom I clung to whenever life tried to twist me into someone smaller. The Florida sun bounced off the ocean outside, spilling across the suite like liquid gold. Bridesmaids chatted about hair, about shoes, about the playlist for the reception. I nodded along, but my ears picked up every sound outside the door. Even when she wasn't in the room, I felt my mother-in-law's presence pressing down on me. Acantha didn't need to be seen to be felt. Her reach extended into every detail, every conversation. I tried to silence the unease. This was my day, after all. If I stayed calm, maybe the day could still be salvaged. But before I had the chance to exhale, my phone buzzed on the vanity. It was a text from Clara, my closest friend from college. "Why didn't I get an invitation? I thought I was on the list." My stomach sank. I blinked at the message, reading it twice, then 3 times, as if repetition would change the words. Clara wasn't just any friend. She was the one who had stood by me through heartbreaks, through endless nights of studying, through the months when I doubted if love would ever come my way. She was supposed to be here, beside me, sharing this day. I pulled the planner aside quietly, trying to keep my voice even. "Can you check something for me?" I asked, showing her the message. The planner frowned, flipping through her tablet. "That's strange," she murmured. "Her name isn't on the final guest list." My chest tightened. "What do you mean it's not on the list? I gave you her name months ago." The planner bit her lip. "It looks like it was removed during revisions." Before I could process it, Acantha swept into the room with the grace of a queen entering her throne hall. Her perfume hit first, roses layered over something sharper, something cold. "Why isn't Clara here?" I asked, my voice steady but sharp enough to cut. Acantha tilted her head, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, that girl. I cut a few names. Family first. Not every friend needs a seat." The casual cruelty in her tone made the bridesmaids shift uncomfortably, but none spoke. "Clara isn't just any friend," I replied, forcing calm. "She's family to me." "Well, Acantha said smoothly, adjusting a strand of pearls around her neck. Now you have a new family. Priorities, darling. I stared at her, swallowing the urge to argue. She wasn't just trimming the guest list, she was trimming my life, deciding which parts of me belonged here and which didn't. Inside, I thought, at American weddings, the guest list isn't just names, it's a map of who matters. By cutting her out, you erased a piece of me. I forced a smile, one that probably looked brittle. Thank you for your input, I said, each word measured. But my mind was already filing this moment away, another cut in a series of silent wounds. As the morning moved toward noon, I turned to my gown, hoping for comfort in the silk and lace that had been chosen with care. My bridesmaids gathered around, cooing at the dress displayed on the mannequin. But the moment my eyes landed on it, my heart stopped. Something was wrong. The neckline, once an elegant sweep that made me feel radiant, had been altered. Extra fabric had been stitched in, high and stiff, covering what had once felt graceful. My hands shook as I touched the seam. The delicate embroidery I had chosen was gone, replaced by heavy folds that didn't belong. Why does this look different? I asked, turning to the seamstress who stood nervously in the corner. She shifted her weight, avoiding my eyes. Mrs. Acantha requested some changes. She said it would be more modest this way. The room went still. One bridesmaid covered her mouth. Another looked at me with wide eyes. I clenched the fabric between my fingers. You altered my dress without asking me? Before the seamstress could answer, Acantha's voice filled the suite again. She had returned without knocking, her timing perfect. It's for your own good, she said lightly, as if she were explaining something obvious. A bride should look respectable, not flashy. Trust me, you'll thank me later. I stared at her, my throat tight. This was my choice, my dress, my day. She waved a hand dismissively. Oh, don't be dramatic. People will remember how elegant you looked, not the details you obsess over. In that moment, I felt stripped, not just of fabric, but of agency. My body, my vision, my presence had been edited to fit her standards. Inside, I thought, my dress, my body, my day, and yet none of it belonged to me anymore. I nodded, too composed for the rage bubbling beneath. Of course, I said softly, my eyes fixed on her. My voice was calm, but inside, I marked the tally of every way she tried to erase me. By the time noon light stretched across the suite, I stood alone for a moment near the window, staring at the ocean. Every detail she touched had turned into a weapon, guest lists, gifts, even the fabric on my back. Each cut was silent but deliberate. Downstairs, I could hear the buzz of guests beginning to arrive. Laughter drifted up, the sound of celebration, but all I felt was the shadow of her presence growing heavier. I pressed my palms flat against the window pane, cold glass against warm skin, and whispered to myself, if she could steal my friends and my dress, what else was she planning to take before the day was done? The chapel smelled of lilies and sea air. Harp music floated through the space, mixing with the sound of waves brushing against the Florida shore just beyond the stained glass windows. The sunlight streamed in at sharp angles, painting the aisle with colors as I stepped into view. Every detail had been curated to look like a dream. And yet, as my eyes traveled toward the front row, something was off. My parents, who had been waiting for this day as much as I had, were not in their rightful place. Instead of sitting proudly in the first row, where the bride's parents traditionally belong, they had been moved behind a cluster of my mother-in-law's relatives. My heart dropped. I caught the murmur of voices around me. Strange, one guest whispered. The bride's parents aren't in front? Another leaned in to reply, I guess the groom's family wanted the seats. At that moment, Acantha leaned toward a nearby guest, her voice carrying easily. Tradition gives that seat to the family who made this possible, she said with a satisfied smile. The words burned, made this possible. She didn't mean my marriage, she meant her money. I looked at my father. He caught my eye, smiled with that same gentle patience he always carried, and shook his head slightly, as if to say, Don't worry, sweetheart. My mother patted his arm and gave me a look of encouragement. Their smiles were soft, but I saw the stiffness in their shoulders, the discomfort in their eyes. They had been pushed aside, and they accepted it so I wouldn't feel the sting. But I did feel it, every bit of it. As the vows continued, I found myself torn between the words spoken and the sight of my parents sitting where they didn't belong. Guests shifted in their seats. A few cast sympathetic glances my way, but no one dared speak against Acantha's authority. She sat tall in the front row, her pearls gleaming, as though she were the one giving her son away. When the ceremony ended, my father squeezed my hand and whispered, "It's fine, sweetheart. Don't let this spoil your day." But inside, my heart whispered a different truth. That's what parents do. They take the hit so you don't feel the blow. But it was me bleeding inside. The hypocrisy gnawed at me. Acantha demanded respect from everyone, but the real respect, the place of honor, belonged to my parents, and she had erased them from it with a flick of her will. The ballroom after the ceremony was glowing with candlelight, laughter rising from the tables as dinner plates clinked. I tried to shake off the sting, telling myself the night could still be salvaged. After the meal, I stood, heart racing, ready to thank the guests and honor the people who had shaped me. The microphone waited at the podium, a simple chance to claim my voice. But just as I reached for it, a manicured hand slid in and took it from me. Acantha's voice rang out, smooth and commanding. "Let me speak on behalf of the family first," she declared, turning to the crowd with a dazzling smile. "The bride will have her chance later." I froze. My hand still hovered where the microphone had been. Guests looked from her to me, some with raised brows, others with forced smiles. She launched into her speech, praising her own family's support, recounting how hard her son had worked to reach this moment, even slipping in a few jabs disguised as jokes. "We're so glad he found someone," she said, pausing for laughter. "She's lucky to join us." The room chuckled. Some guests laughed loudly, others shifted in discomfort. I clenched my hands under the tablecloth, nails biting into my palm. My smile was plastered on, but inside, my rage simmered. Every word she spoke minimized me, reduced me to an accessory, an afterthought. Guests raised glasses, clapping politely, as if her version of the story was the one that mattered. I wanted to stand, to take the mic back, to shout, "This is my wedding, my life," but I didn't. Instead, I sat in silence, feeling the sting of invisibility sharpen with every word she stole. When she finally returned to her seat, the applause echoed like judgment. Guests looked at me expectantly, waiting for my smile, my approval, as though the insult hadn't just unfolded in plain view. I lifted my glass, forcing a polite laugh. "Thank you," I said simply. But inside, my voice screamed. Every public word she stole from me was another brick in the wall she was building to shut me out. One day, she'll realize she didn't erase me. She only carved my anger deeper. I smiled, but my thoughts grew sharper. She thinks she won tonight. She has no idea what storms silence can breed, and I had no idea her next move would make the whole room laugh at my expense. Dinner ended with the clink of forks against plates and the shuffle of servers clearing dishes. The ballroom smelled faintly of roasted garlic and champagne, and I allowed myself a moment to exhale. Maybe now I would finally have the chance to thank the people who had come, to stand in front of them as the bride instead of the silent figure sitting at the edge of her own wedding. But unease tugged at me. From across the room, I noticed Acantha leaning toward her sisters-in-law, her voice low but animated. They laughed, covering their mouths with delicate hands, their pearls rattling as they leaned in closer. I didn't need to hear the words to know they weren't planning anything in my favor. I thought of the old proverb my father loved: "Give someone an inch, and they'll take a mile." Tonight, Acantha had already taken a front-row seat that didn't belong to her, a microphone that wasn't hers, and now she looked ready for more. I steadied my glass of water and tried to smile at the guests around me, but the suspicion stayed, like a shadow creeping just out of sight. The gift table was wheeled closer to the dance floor, and guests gathered as presents were brought forward to be acknowledged. A photographer circled, eager to capture every smiling exchange. My parents stepped forward, carrying a framed photo wrapped in tissue. It was a family portrait of us taken last fall, meant as a reminder that I would always belong to them, even as I entered a new family. Before I could stand and thank them, Acantha intercepted. She clapped her hands loudly, ensuring attention turned to her, and gestured at the frame. "This was my idea," she declared smoothly, lifting the photo for everyone to see. "I thought it would be the perfect way to remind her that she's part of us now. Family is forever, isn't it?" The room responded with polite applause. My parents froze, their smiles fading. My father shifted his weight, his eyes downcast. My mother looked at me as though apologizing without words. I wanted to shout, "No, that's ours. That was their love, their gift, not yours." Instead, I pressed my hands together on my lap, forcing composure. The silence between us said more than an argument ever could. Sometimes, silence screams louder than words. Guests moved on quickly, but my chest burned. This wasn't just about a picture. It was about erasing who I was, reshaping my story to fit hers. By claiming the gift, she had stolen not just credit, but identity. I turned to my father later, when the crowd had dispersed a little. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. He shook his head, his voice soft. "Don't apologize, sweetheart. We know the truth." But the truth hidden in our hearts wasn't the truth the room had heard, and that was the wound. As the evening moved outdoors to the resort garden for official photos, I thought maybe I could reclaim a piece of the day. The Florida night air was warm, the scent of salt and orchids mingling. Strings of lights hung over the hedges, twinkling like stars. The photographer lined us up, calling out names briskly, organizing relatives. "Bride and groom in the center," he directed, his accent sharp. But before I could settle beside my husband, Acantha swept forward. "I'll stand here," she said, planting herself firmly at his side. She motioned for her relatives to gather around, pushing them in close. "Yes, yes, family together." I looked around, waiting for someone to correct her, but no one spoke. My mother and father hovered at the edge of the group. When they tried to step forward, Acantha waved her hand, saying, "Oh no, we'll take one with you later. Right now, let's keep it clean. Keep it clean," as though my parents were stains on the picture. The photographer hesitated but complied, snapping shot after shot of Acantha beaming beside her son, me pressed awkwardly to the side. The camera clicked like a gavel, sealing her version of the truth. Guests muttered, some exchanging glances, but nobody challenged her. And with every flash, I felt the erasure deepen. Inside, I thought, this was my wedding, yet every picture looked like her coronation. I stood stiff, my smile frozen, my jaw aching. The photographs would last forever, and they would tell a story that wasn't mine. When at last my parents were allowed into a frame, they were pushed to the corners, almost out of sight. The photographer didn't linger on those shots. I knew when the album arrived, the dominant images would show Acantha reigning in the middle, my parents fading into the edges. And I realized then, it wasn't incompetence or carelessness. It was deliberate. She wasn't just trying to humiliate me. She was rewriting the family record. Later, as the group began to disperse, I lingered in the shadows of the garden, my gown heavy in the humid air. The laughter of relatives drifted through the hedges, their joy unshaken. I pressed my hands against the bark of a tree, grounding myself. I wasn't invisible by accident. I was being made invisible on purpose. And the next humiliation wouldn't just sting. It would make the entire room laugh at me. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as servers poured fresh wine into glistening glasses. Guests leaned back in their chairs, bellies full from dinner, laughter buzzing around the room like bees. It was time for the toasts. My heart pounded because this was supposed to be the moment when people honored us, when I could finally thank those who stood by me. I straightened my shoulders, rehearsing the words in my head. But the memory of my mother-in-law snatching the microphone earlier in the evening still lingered like smoke. Would she do it again? I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. As the clinking of glasses echoed, people joked about who would cry first during speeches, whether the best man would roast the groom, whether the maid of honor would embarrass me with college stories. It was all normal chatter for a wedding reception, but I knew from experience, jokes at these events often had teeth. Americans say there's truth in every joke. and I had a sinking feeling that tonight those truths would be aimed straight at me. Sure enough, the microphone was in her hands again. Acantha stood confidently, her gown shimmering under the lights, her pearls catching every camera flash. She tilted her head, feigning sweetness. "Well," she began, her voice loud enough to silence the room, "marriage is all about compromise, and of course, finances." She paused, smiling as though she'd just set up a punchline. Then she delivered it. "At least my son won't need to worry about his credit card. She knows how to swipe." The room erupted. Laughter spilled across tables like broken glass scattering. Some guests clapped, others slapped the table as if it were the funniest thing they'd ever heard. My husband shifted uncomfortably, his smile tight, his eyes avoiding mine. My parents, seated a few tables back, froze. My father looked down at his plate, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Inside, the words cut me raw. I wasn't a person in her eyes. I was a punchline. A bridesmaid whispered, "That's not right," but didn't dare say it louder. I held my glass firmly, refusing to let my hands tremble. I locked my eyes on Acantha, letting her see that I would not crumble. "You won't break me here," I told her silently. She smiled back, victorious, as though she had scored another round. The humiliation pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. But beneath it, something else grew stronger: defiance. As the laughter softened and the clinking of glasses resumed, Acantha shifted her tone. She raised her wine, her voice dipping into something more solemn, as though she were about to deliver a heartfelt tribute. "On a serious note," she said, her hand shaking just enough to look dramatic, "without me, this wedding wouldn't even happen." A few guests gasped. Others chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or nod. I froze. My parents' faces flushed crimson. They had contributed so much, not just financially but emotionally, supporting me every step of the way. And yet here, in front of everyone, their sacrifices were erased in a single sentence. She didn't just want credit, I thought bitterly. She wanted to erase everyone else, to make the story hers. Guests whispered, "She paid for everything?" One murmured. Another nodded. "Must be nice." I caught eyes darting toward me, sympathy mixed with judgment. I forced my lips into a polite smile, though my jaw ached from holding it. "Thank you for your generosity," I said when she finally returned the microphone. My voice was even, but inside my thoughts seared. Respect bought with money isn't respect. It's debt collection. The applause that followed wasn't for me, it was for her. For the illusion she had built in that room, that she was the savior of this day, the queen who had made it all possible. And I knew then, every time she raised her glass, it wasn't just to celebrate, it was to remind everyone who held the power. I sat back in my chair, my smile frozen in place as laughter and chatter swelled again. Inside, my rage simmered, a low, steady burn. Humor and money, her two blades, and she wasn't done cutting. The ballroom's noise seemed distant now, muffled under the weight of my thoughts. Around me, the laughter faded into something heavier, a silence that pressed on my skin like heat. And I knew the next blow wouldn't just stain my pride, it would leave a mark for everyone to see. The applause that followed Acantha's smug toast was hesitant, the kind that didn't know whether to be polite or concerned. Glasses clinked half-heartedly, and murmurs rippled through the tables. My parents' eyes met mine from across the room. My father gave me a small nod. My mother mouthed, "Stay strong." But the ache in my chest told me that something had already been broken. Acantha raised her glass again, the corners of her mouth lifted in triumph. She basked in the glow of her own performance, as though she had just cemented her legacy as the savior of the evening. I studied her smile and felt a chill crawl down my spine. In every silence, humiliation echoes louder. That thought repeated in my mind as I sat frozen. Around me, servers cleared plates and poured another round of red wine. My fingers tapped lightly against the tablecloth, as though bracing for an earthquake I knew was coming. She lingered too close, her movements deliberate. And deep inside, I sensed it. Another strike was on its way. The moment came so suddenly, it felt staged. Acantha leaned across the table during another round of toasts, her wineglass tipping precariously. I could see the red liquid shift like a tide just before it spilled. And then it happened. She tilted her wrist ever so slightly, sending a wave of crimson cascading down the front of my white gown. Gasps filled the ballroom. My breath caught as I felt the cold liquid soak into the lace, spreading outward like a wound that refused to close. The red against white was a picture of destruction, stark, visible, impossible to hide. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, pressing her hand to her chest in mock horror. "I'm so clumsy." Her words carried the false innocence of a child caught with candy in her pocket. Guests chuckled nervously, unsure whether to believe her accident or see it for what it was. An attack dressed as mishap. Some reached for napkins but stopped short when they saw me unmoving. My eyes stayed locked on her face. Inside, my thoughts were sharp. This wasn't an accident. This was her masterpiece. I heard whispers behind me. "Was that on purpose?" Another voice answered. "No one ruins a gown like that without meaning to." I stood motionless, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against me. My humiliation wasn't private. It was a spectacle. I picked up a napkin with deliberate care. My hand moved slowly, dabbing at the spreading stain as if I had all the time in the world. The fabric was ruined. No gesture could undo the damage. But control was mine. I forced a smile, the kind that carried steel beneath its edges. My voice didn't tremble when I finally spoke. "It happens," I said softly. Inside, my thoughts seared. Crying would give her victory. Anger would give her audience. Silence gave me control. Guests shifted in their seats, some whispering, others nodding as though impressed by my composure. "She's handling it so gracefully," I overheard one woman say. Another whispered, "I don't believe that was an accident." My groom leaned toward me, his voice low and defensive. "Mom didn't mean it," he said quickly, as if rehearsed. I turned my eyes to him. "Didn't she?" I asked quietly, letting the question hang heavy in the air. He looked away, fiddling with the edge of his napkin. My parents watched from their table, their faces stiff with fury. My father's jaw was tight, my mother's eyes glistened, but neither spoke. They knew this wasn't their battlefield, though their silence was filled with rage. I dabbed again, slowly, never breaking the mask of serenity. Inside, my anger grew sharper, not wilder. Strength isn't in the scream, it's in the restraint. I realized in that moment that her weapons, wine, words, whispers, would never be enough to end me. They would only sharpen the resolve inside me. When the stain had stopped spreading, I set the napkin aside and lifted my chin. The music in the background returned. Guests resumed their chatter, but I knew every person in that room had seen what happened. Every eye had watched the red bleed into the white. I smiled and sipped my water, calm and unshaken on the outside, but my thoughts whispered the truth. The stain would fade from my dress, but the mark she left on me tonight would never wash out. And just when I thought she couldn't cut deeper, the person I trusted most handed me a wound I never saw coming. The ballroom hummed with uneasy chatter after the wine spill. Guests tried to return to their meals, forks clinking against plates, but their eyes kept darting back toward me. Some whispered, others avoided my gaze entirely. The laughter had thinned, but the humiliation clung to me like the red stains spreading across my gown. I turned toward my groom, hoping for comfort, maybe just a reassuring squeeze of my hand. Instead, he shrugged, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "That's just how Mom is." I froze. Not even a glance of solidarity, not a whisper of defense. He had seen me drenched, humiliated in front of 200 people, and the best he could manage was a shrug. Inside, my chest tightened. He didn't defend me, not even with a glance. He defended her instead. There's a saying I grew up with, silence speaks louder than words, and in that moment, his silence roared. As the courses shifted to dessert, I replayed his promises in my head. All those late-night talks before the wedding, him swearing he would always protect me, that I would never feel alone with him. Now, those promises felt like cheap words scattered on the floor. I leaned closer and whispered, "Why didn't you say something? Everyone saw what she did." He kept his eyes on his plate, pushing a fork through untouched cake. "Don't make a scene." My jaw tightened. "I wasn't making a scene." She was, yet I'm the one told to stay quiet. He sighed, his tone defensive. She's under stress. Weddings bring out the worst in her. It's just tradition. Tradition? I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. Since when is it tradition to humiliate the bride at her own wedding? He didn't answer. He took a sip of his wine instead, his silence saying more than his words ever could. From nearby tables, I caught the way guests looked at me, pity mixed with judgment. To them, his silence was agreement. And suddenly, I wasn't just isolated from his family, but from him as well. The betrayal wasn't in a shout. It wasn't in a slap. It was in his refusal to stand beside me. Later in the evening, as music swelled and people moved toward the dance floor, I saw her again. Acantha stood at the edge of the room with her son beside her, their heads tilted together like conspirators. I drifted closer, unseen in the crowd, and caught her words. "If she doesn't behave, we can still stop this," she whispered, her tone calm but cold. My groom's head bobbed slightly, a nervous nod. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darted away, never once meeting mine across the room. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. He wasn't my partner tonight. He was her soldier. The weight of that realization was heavier than the red stain on my dress. This wasn't just silence anymore. It was submission. He was tethered to her, every move dictated by her whispers. I turned away before either of them could notice my stare. Inside, the fury sharpened into something icy, something unshakable. It wasn't just her cruelty I had to reckon with, it was his loyalty to her over me. Americans my age know this story too well. Sons who never cut the cord, wives who are treated like intruders in their own marriages. The toxic mother-son bond where boundaries collapse and loyalty shifts away from the person who should matter most. I gripped the edge of a chair, steadying myself. I refused to cry, refused to let the room see me break. I breathed deeply, forcing composure while laughter bubbled around me. Guests traded jokes, oblivious to the fracture forming at the head table. They clapped along to the music, their joy unshaken, while mine lay splintered. She spilled wine on my dress, but he spilled acid on my trust. That truth pressed against my ribs, suffocating in its sharpness. And just when I thought the night couldn't turn crueler, the entire room would soon be laughing at me together. The laughter that had once been scattered across a few tables now rolled through the entire ballroom like wildfire. Acantha's voice carried effortlessly above the clinking of glasses, her latest joke sharper than any of the others. She leaned into the microphone with a smirk that made my stomach twist. "She's just lucky he chose her," she said, drawing out each word as if she were delivering a punchline rehearsed for weeks. "Imagine, my son, with all his prospects, and here she is, the one who managed to hold his attention." The eruption of laughter that followed was deafening. Guests clapped, some even stomping their feet on the carpeted floor as if it were a comedy show. The spotlight no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a stage where I had become the entertainment. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, a smile carved into my face that felt like stone. Inside, the words echoed. It wasn't just her anymore. It was everyone. I was no longer the bride. I was the punchline. I heard snippets from the tables near me. "That's what makes a good show," someone said, laughing. Another voice added, "She should be grateful." The sound stung more than the red wine soaking into my gown. The laughter kept spreading, carrying through the room like a cruel tide. My groom's colleagues were the loudest, their guffaws rattling the glasses on their table. They slapped each other on the back, repeating her words as if it were the cleverest line of the night. Not everyone laughed. Some guests kept their eyes on their plates, embarrassed but unwilling to speak. Their silence was complicity, and it was just as loud as the laughter. My parents shifted uncomfortably, my mother's hand gripping the edge of her napkin, my father whispering under his breath, "Enough." But no one listened. Their protest was swallowed by the noise. I turned my head slightly toward my groom, praying for a sliver of support. Instead, he leaned in and whispered, "Don't ruin the mood." My chest tightened. "The mood?" I whispered back. "They're laughing at me, not with me." He sighed, his jaw tense. Just let it go. She doesn't mean harm. His words were another cut, sharper than the rest. Injustice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it echoes in laughter. I swallowed my pride, straightened my back, and locked eyes with Acantha across the room. She looked triumphant, her smile wide, her hand still clutching the microphone. My silent thought was clear. If they wanted a silent victim, they had chosen the wrong woman. As the last chuckles died away, the energy in the room shifted. It was as if the air itself turned heavy, pressing against every shoulder. An uncomfortable silence spread, thicker than the laughter that had come before. Guests fidgeted with their forks, glanced at one another, unsure what to say next. The ballroom, once filled with noise, now throbbed with quiet unease. I could feel the weight of that silence pressing into me. It was louder than the laughter. It said everything people were too cowardly to speak. Acantha, never one to let go of power, raised her glass again as though nothing had happened. "To family," she said with artificial warmth, pretending the cruelty hadn't just spilled into the room. Her control wrapped around the silence like chains. I looked at her, my gown still stained, my dignity bruised, but not broken. Eleanor Roosevelt's words came back to me. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I breathed deeply, straightened my shoulders, and told myself, I will not give her my consent. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, but inside me, it felt different. It wasn't defeat, it was the calm before a storm. Guests eventually returned to their chatter, conversations picking up hesitantly as if they could erase what had just unfolded. But I knew the tide had turned. They thought the silence meant the moment was over. They were wrong. I stared at the flicker of candles on the tables, my jaw set, my pulse steady. They laughed. They silenced me. But storms are born from silence too. And in that silence, the first crack of thunder was about to strike, from a place no one expected. The ballroom sat in heavy silence after the laughter finally drained away. Forks hovered above plates, glasses sat half full, untouched, and no one seemed willing to break the stillness. The weight of it pressed against my shoulders until I thought I'd collapse beneath it. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something, someone, who might still see me as more than the spectacle I'd become. That's when I caught sight of him, my groom's brother. He hadn't joined in the laughter, hadn't averted his gaze like so many others. Instead, he had been watching, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the stem of his glass. His silence wasn't passive, it was sharp, seething. In a room full of people who laughed at me, only his eyes told me I wasn't crazy. Only his expression said what no one else dared to voice. This is wrong. For the first time that night, I felt a flicker of hope, fragile and trembling, but alive. Our eyes met and held, longer than polite, long enough for me to feel the message in it. I see you. He straightened, setting his glass down with care. Across from him, my groom couldn't even meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on the tablecloth, chained to his mother's influence like a boy too afraid to let go. Guests whispered nervously, the tension rising with each passing second. Some looked at me with pity, others at Acantha with admiration, but all of them waited for someone to end the silence. I remembered another saying, one I'd once underlined in a book. Sometimes courage comes from the unlikeliest places. The brother shifted in his seat, adjusted his jacket, and rose slowly. The scrape of his chair against the polished floor made heads turn. He stood tall, taller than I'd ever seen him, and for a heartbeat I thought he might falter. But then his shoulders squared, and his eyes fixed on Acantha. The suspense was unbearable. My chest burned with anticipation, every muscle in my body straining toward him as he stepped forward. His hand brushed against the microphone stand, and for a moment, time held its breath. It happened in an instant. 1 second, Acantha was speaking, relishing her control, and the next, the microphone was ripped from her hand. Gasps filled the air like a wave crashing against rock. Someone dropped a fork that clattered loudly against the floor. "What are you doing?" Acantha demanded, her laugh shaky, trying to disguise the sudden crack in her poise. For a brief moment his voice trembled, but then it rose, steady and fierce. Enough. The single word echoed through the room with the weight of thunder. It wasn't just the sound, it was the power behind it, the conviction that silenced every murmur and pinned every eye to him. The ballroom froze. Conversations died mid-breath. Forks lowered onto plates. People leaned in, as if afraid to miss the next words. I pressed a hand against my gown, the ruined lace sticky with dried wine, and thought, it wasn't just the word, it was the weight in his voice, the thunder no one expected. Before he could continue, a guest near the bar blurted out nervously, his voice carrying across the stunned quiet. Well, she tried to stop this wedding last month anyway. The words hit like a stone through glass. Gasps erupted. Heads turned toward Acantha. Her face froze, the smile cracking just enough to betray the truth. The brother seized the moment. Yes, he said, his voice firm, and that's exactly why I can't stay silent anymore. Whispers surged like fire through dry grass. Guests leaned toward one another, their shock obvious, their loyalty shifting in real time. The carefully crafted image Acantha had built for herself faltered before my eyes. Inside, something stirred. Vindication. For the first time that night, the room wasn't laughing at me. It was turning against her. The mask she wore so easily was slipping, and everyone could see it. I looked around the ballroom, breathing deeply. My humiliation still clung to me, but it felt different now, less like chains, more like fuel. For the first time that night, the laughter wasn't mine to carry, it was hers, and with the microphone in his hand, he was about to tell them the truth she had buried. The room felt like a courtroom after the confession slipped out in Chapter 9. Every face turned toward Acantha, the chandeliers catching the shock in their widened eyes. Forks and knives lay idle against porcelain, glasses untouched. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of us. Acantha let out a brittle laugh, tilting her head as though the accusation were absurd. Nonsense, she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the silence. People say things when they've had too much to drink. But her face betrayed her. A flush crept up her neck, and for the first time that evening, her smile didn't hold. My groom sat pale beside me, his hand twitching nervously on the table. He didn't deny it. He didn't say a word. He only stared down at the tablecloth like a child caught in a lie. My brother-in-law's grip on the microphone tightened, both hands steadying it as though he were holding a gavel. His eyes didn't leave Acantha. The air shifted, heavy with anticipation. I thought to myself, the room isn't mine, not yet, but it isn't hers anymore either. Every heartbeat felt like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Then his voice rang clear. She tried to call off this wedding, he said. She hired an attorney. She threatened to drag the family name through court if it went forward. Gasps tore through the room. A woman near the back pressed her hand to her chest. A man muttered, "Unbelievable." Acantha shot up straighter in her chair, her pearls catching the light as though they were strangling her. "That's taken out of context," she sputtered. But her son's brother reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. He held it high. "This is her email, dated 4 weeks ago. She spelled it out herself. Stop the wedding before it ruins everything." Whispers broke like waves crashing against the shore. "So it's true," someone hissed. She really did try to stop it. I felt my breath hitch, memories of every cutting remark, every humiliation from earlier in the night rushing back. They weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were part of a larger plan to erase me entirely. My chest ached, but beneath the pain there was fire. The truth doesn't just free you, it chains the liar. Acantha's lips parted and closed again, like a fish gasping for air. That's not what I meant," she tried again. "It's misinterpreted." But the evidence in his hand silenced her. The ballroom buzzed louder now, not with laughter, but outrage. Guests shook their heads. One woman whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." Another muttered, "She's finished." Acantha, desperate to regain control, reached for her glass of wine. She stood, holding it high. "To family!" But her hand trembled violently. The stem slipped between her fingers, and before she could steady it, the glass fell, shattering against the marble floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Red liquid splashed upward, staining the hem of her own gown. A hush blanketed the room again. This time it wasn't for me. It was for her. "She's finished," a man whispered at the next table. "Look at her hands," another guest murmured. For the first time that night, I didn't feel the weight of every eye. It wasn't me standing in shame. It was her. I watched her bend, her once perfect posture crumpling as she stared at the spreading stain on her dress, and I thought, for the first time, it wasn't me who stood in red. It was her. My groom lowered his head, hiding his face in his hands. He didn't move to defend her, not this time. His silence was no longer loyalty. It was shame. Beside him, his brother kept his voice steady, unwavering. "Respect is not demanded," he said firmly into the microphone. "It is earned." The words hung in the air like a sentence passed down. The buzz of voices swelled again, a mixture of shock, outrage, and dawning realization. Guests leaned in close to one another, whispering about what had just been exposed. Some shook their heads, others narrowed their eyes at Acantha as she stood trembling in the spotlight she had once owned so easily. I breathed in, steadying myself, letting the image sear into my memory. Her mask cracked, her empire unraveling. Every mask eventually cracks, hers shattered with a sound louder than her broken glass. And in the shards at her feet, I saw the pieces of the empire she thought she ruled. The ballroom had changed. It no longer buzzed with the kind of laughter that once mocked me. It hummed with something heavier, something close to regret. I could hear it in the whispers, see it in the way people avoided my eyes. Some of them, the same ones who had laughed the loudest, now looked ashamed. My parents sat taller than before. Their dignity had been bruised all evening, but now nods of acknowledgement came their way from relatives who had ignored them hours earlier. I caught my father's small, steady smile. My mother's hand squeezed mine briefly under the table. For once, others finally saw what I had always known. They were the ones who deserved respect, not the woman who had stolen it. Beside me, my groom sat pale, his hands pressed together, knuckles white. He didn't look at me. His silence was a wall, and every second he kept his head down, the wall grew taller. The truth freed me, I thought, but it also revealed who would never stand beside me. There's a phrase I've always remembered. When people show you where their loyalty lies, believe them. Tonight, his loyalty wasn't with me, and I believed him. I stood slowly, the sound of my chair scraping across the polished floor slicing through the murmurs. The envelope in my hand was thin, but it carried the weight of every dollar I had quietly contributed, every sacrifice unacknowledged. My voice was calm, clear. "This," I said, lifting the envelope so all could see, "is the last check I'll ever sign in this family's name." Gasps rippled through the room. The music stopped. Even the servers froze in place, their trays suspended mid-air. Acantha's eyes widened, her mouth parting but no words forming. For once, she had no script. I walked to her table, each step deliberate, and set the envelope down firmly in front of her. The sound of paper against wood was louder than any toast that had been made that evening. "Money once chained me to your approval," I said, meeting her gaze. "Tonight, it frees me from it." The silence was thick, stunned. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in, eager not to miss a word. I felt taller in that moment, not because of the gown or the setting, but because I had finally severed the cord she had wrapped around me. She sat frozen, her hand hovering above the envelope but never touching it. Around her, the people who had once laughed at her jokes now avoided her eyes. Beside me, my groom leaned in, his voice frantic, desperate. "Why did you do that?" he whispered. "You're making it worse." I turned to him, my voice steady, low. "Worse for who? For her? Or for you?" He blinked, stunned into silence. His inability to answer spoke louder than anything he could have said. Guests began murmuring again. Some nodded toward me, whispering words like brave and strong. Others looked at him, shaking their heads. It was clear now. My strength stood in sharp contrast to his weakness. My parents caught my eye from across the room. My mother's eyes glistened, not with sadness this time, but with pride. My father gave me the smallest of nods, a signal that he understood exactly what I had done and why. Still, I could see the heaviness in them. They knew this choice would change everything, maybe even my marriage. Sometimes liberation costs you the people you thought you needed most. That truth landed heavily in my chest. But instead of breaking me, it steadied me. I recognized finally that my survival didn't depend on his loyalty. It depended on mine, to myself. The room didn't erupt into applause like a fairy tale. Instead, there was a slow, growing acknowledgement. Some clapped softly, others murmured, "Good for her," under their breath. It wasn't a celebration, it was respect, earned in the hardest way possible. I stood straighter, my hands no longer trembling. For the first time that night, I wasn't just reacting to her cruelty. I was writing my own ending. I wasn't just ending her control, I thought. I was rewriting my story. The whispers swelled again, spreading across the room like a tide. She finally stood up. Did you see the way she said it? She's braver than all of them. Some guests even stood briefly, offering me a quiet ovation before sitting back down. The sound was soft, but it filled the cracks of the night with something solid. I caught sight of Acantha still staring at the envelope, as though it might burn her fingers if she touched it. She was trembling, her mask stripped away. And as the night wound on, I knew this wasn't the end. One final voice was still missing, the one who had stayed silent until now, watching everything from the shadows. The storm wasn't quite over, but the winds had shifted, and this time, they were at my back. The room was still buzzing after I laid the envelope on Acantha's table. Some guests applauded quietly, their hands coming together not out of joy, but out of respect. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their gazes carefully avoiding hers, as though looking at her now might implicate them in her downfall. My parents watched with tears in their eyes, this time not of sorrow, but of vindication. My father gave me a firm nod, my mother pressed her hand against her heart. Their support was silent, but it wrapped around me more securely than any vow I had heard that night. Across from me, my groom sat pale, his lips pressed shut, his eyes pinned to the floor. Still silent, still chained. His face carried the look of defeat, not defiance. I had cut the chain, but he had chosen to stay bound. The envelope sat there like a wall between us, not just a piece of paper, but a line in the sand. Hemingway's words flickered in my mind. Courage is grace under pressure. For the first time that night, I felt what those words truly meant. Then the brother rose again. His movements were deliberate, steady. He walked to the microphone with none of the hesitance from earlier. His voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Respect isn't given by age," he said firmly, scanning the room. "It's earned by action." Gasps rippled, then silence followed. A silence that didn't belong to Acantha anymore. It belonged to him. The pause broke as applause erupted like fire catching dry grass. Some clapped slowly at first, then louder, until the room filled with thunder. Guests nodded, whispering to each other, "He's right." And, "It's about time someone said it." Acantha's face crumbled. The pearls at her neck seemed to weigh her down. For years she had demanded respect through intimidation, through control. And in a single sentence, her empire cracked. I stood frozen, but inside me there was movement, a flood of recognition. He said what everyone knew but never dared to speak. His words completed what my envelope had started. The chain of her power was not just cut, it was gone. I felt the weight of the night settle into something new. My humiliation, my silence, the stain on my gown, all of it had been fuel for this moment. I rose once more, my voice carrying across the ballroom. Tonight wasn't the wedding I dreamed of, but it was the night I stopped letting others write my story. The guests erupted in applause, some even standing. My parents joined them, clapping proudly, their faces lit with triumph. My groom stayed seated, his head bowed, shame etched across his features. No redemption would come for him tonight. I looked at him once, long enough to understand the truth. My future would not be bound to someone who couldn't stand beside me. That realization was bittersweet, but it was liberation all the same. Family isn't who silences you. Family is who hears you. The applause washed over me like a tide. For the first time that night, I wasn't shrinking under its weight. I was lifted by it. The ballroom quieted again as people began to gather their things, preparing to leave. The whispers spread through the room, weaving into a chorus. She was stronger than all of them. She ended it. She'll be just fine. I stood tall, no longer afraid of their voices. My parents embraced me, their pride palpable. The brother offered me a nod, silent acknowledgement of the war we had fought together in that room. I turned toward the doors of the ballroom, my ruined dress heavy but no longer a burden. Every step felt lighter than the last. They mocked me, they tried to erase me, but tonight I left them with something they couldn't laugh away. As the night air greeted me outside, cool against my flushed skin, I breathed deeply. The storm had ended. And as I stepped out of that ballroom, I knew the storm had ended, but I had just begun.